So we were talking about a couple of phrases that need some clarity before we start our discussion on relevancy of facts. And the phrases that we had discussed include the word fact itself, then fact in issue, and last but not the least, issues of fact. As far as the last one, issues of fact, is concerned, we had seen that that occurs in the explanation that has been appended to the definition. And I had given you some examples. I had referred to the relevant order from CPC. You may remember Order 14, Rule 1, and few sub-rules to drive home the point that what is meant by issues of fact. I had also referred to the criminal proceeding and mentioned that charges are framed by the court under provisions such as sections 228, 240 and 246. And as a student of criminal procedure, you would be having some opportunity to discuss in detail the difference between what we call filing of charge sheet and framing of charges. This is not the occasion to discuss all that, but what I believe is that some better clarity is required as far as the last phrase that we had discussed in the last class, issue of fact or issues of fact, is concerned. So let me quote the explanation again, and very quickly let me discuss that with help of another illustration. The explanation reads, and I quote, "Whenever under the provisions of the law for the time being in force relating to civil procedure," reference here is to CPC of 1908, I had already mentioned, "any court records an issue of fact. The fact to be asserted or denied in the answer to such issue is a fact in issue." Let me take one simple illustration. Suppose A files a suit against B for recovering money due on a promissory note. B denies the execution of the note and also that A lent him any money. So the issues of fact will be: first, did A lend money to B? Second, did B execute the promissory note? Third, what amount must be paid by B to A? And lastly, to what further relief is A entitled? Suppose again that the answers which are given by the court to these questions are: first, A lent the money to B. This is the answer to the first issue of fact. A lent the money to B. Second, B executed the promissory note. Third, B is liable to repay the principal amount and also interest calculated at a certain rate. For example, at the rate of 6% per annum or 10% per annum, whatever. Every one of these answers is a fact in issue, because each is a fact and each, in conjunction with others, establishes the existence and extent of B's liability, which is asserted by A and denied by B in this civil proceeding. And this is exactly what the explanation says. So if there are issues of fact, the answers are facts in issue. Similarly, if the answers that are given by the court to the questions are that A did not lend the money, that B did not execute the note, and that B is not liable to pay anything to A, these answers are facts in issue, because each is a fact and each by itself or in connection with the others establishes the non-existence of B's liability, which according to A exists, but according to B does not exist. But more than these phrases that we have discussed, the word fact, the phrase fact in issue, and the other phrase issue of fact or issues of fact, another phrase is of immense relevance and immense importance, and that phrase is relevant facts. Now when you look at the first provision of the next chapter, the second chapter, which is of relevancy of facts, you would find in section 5 that evidence can be given of the existence or non-existence of a fact in issue or a relevant fact. And nothing else. Now what is the meaning of fact in issue has already been looked into, has already been discussed, and now it's time to look into what we call relevant fact. I know that in Dr. A.P. Singh's class you must have discussed this phrase. But before I talk about the scheme of relevancy of facts, I must say something of my own to bring better clarity on this issue as far as relevant fact is concerned, as far as this phrase relevant fact is concerned. What facts are relevant facts? And what is the meaning of relevant? Again, the answer is to be found in section 3 itself, which is the definition clause. We have been hovering around section 3 for quite some time, and for reason that before you are launched into the realm of scheme of relevancy and other critical issues, these words and phrases must be understood in their proper perspective. So what facts are relevant facts? Now, relevancy means connection in such a way that belief in one fact helps the court to come to a conclusion about the existence of another fact. If such a connection exists, what connection? That belief in one fact helps the court to come to a conclusion about the existence of another fact. This connection, where exists, it is said that the first fact is relevant to the second one. And let's talk about the statutory meaning of the word relevant. Section 3 reads, and I quote, "One fact is said to be relevant to another when the one is connected with the other in any of the ways referred to in the provisions of this act relating to the relevancy of facts." Let me repeat. What ways this definition is talking about? One fact is said to be relevant to another when the one is connected with the other in any of the ways referred to in the provisions of this act relating to the relevancy of facts, and these provisions are to be found from section 6 to section 55 of the Indian Evidence Act. So what these rules are? These rules are merely the principles on which the judges in England have conventionally admitted facts into an inquiry as being relevant. Simple. For example, Vepasarthi has cited this example in his book. A judge in England decided that a particular fact is relevant because it operates as a motive for the fact in issue. Therefore, Sir James Stephen says in section 8, any fact is relevant which shows or constitutes a motive or preparation for any fact in issue or relevant fact. You may remember in our criminal law class in IPC 1 we had discussed that how motive is not a constituting element of crime. But in the same breath, I had also told you that how motive is relevant. At that point in time, certainly you are not exposed to the idea of relevancy. Or what does relevancy in fact mean in a judicial proceeding, especially in a criminal proceeding? Here is what is meant by that motive is relevant. It simply means that for example, in a criminal trial, if the prosecution seeks to adduce evidence of motive for committing a crime, motive being relevant, would be admissible, or evidence relating to motive would be admissible. So there are multiple rules from section 6 to section 55. I reiterate, I repeat. And as you would be progressing and you would be developing a better insight into these rules, you would find that there is a certain overlapping in these rules. And what I mean by overlapping in these rules, it simply means that a fact could be relevant under one or the other section. That a fact could be relevant under more than one section. And this is because with respect to the same fact, one English judge might have received it as relevant because it constitutes, say for example, preparation. Another English judge might have received it as relevant because it constitutes conduct. And in our scheme of things, in our act, the Indian Evidence Act, we will find rules corresponding to both preparation and conduct as two distinct rules. So facts which constitute preparation for the happening of the fact in issue or relevant fact would be relevant. Also facts which constitute the conduct would be relevant. Conduct subsequent to or prior to the commission. And you would find that the word conduct may include and at times shall include, for example, preparation as well. But what you need to note, what you need to keep in mind, that if a fact is logically relevant, and please remember this phrase again, logically relevant, and there is no reason for excluding it, it must be also legally relevant. And the fact that it is legally relevant under more than one section or one rule does not matter. It doesn't matter. Stephen's anxiety was to make it relevant at least under one section. If it was considered to be, if it was traditionally received in evidence as a relevant fact, his anxiety was to make it relevant at least under one section. Only if you are not able to bring a fact under any of the sections. Which sections? Again, from 6 to 55. That it becomes irrelevant. That it becomes not relevant. So what is this logical and legal relevancy? And how do we appreciate this difference between logical and legal relevancy? Again, Vepa Sarthi says that the best way of appreciating the difference between legal and logical relevancy is to consider the attitude of the judges in England and India. But this has to be taken with a rider. Common law, as the English law is traditionally referred to, not only related to substantive law, that there would be common law definitions, it also related to procedure, and it also related to the rules of evidence, meaning thereby not only there were common law offences, there were common law rules of evidence as well. Things have changed, and changed for good, both in the realm of substantive law and the procedural law in England. And barring a few exceptions, of course, the entire substantive law is now codified there in different statutes. That's another matter altogether. Similarly, you may remember in the initial classes, I had told you that what England today suffers when it comes to the rules of evidence is a problem of plenty. In the past few decades, they have enacted multiple legislations, multiple statutes, codifying at times the common law rules of evidence. Separately, rules that would apply exclusively to the criminal proceedings and rules that would apply exclusively to the civil proceedings are mentioned, you may remember. But still, let me tell you, a large portion of English law of evidence is uncodified, is still governed by the common law principles. And then this is exactly what Vepa is referring to when he says that the best way of appreciating the difference between logical and legal relevancy is to consider the attitude of judges in England and India. When a particular fact is offered as a relevant evidence, the English judge asks this question to himself: is it logically relevant? Is it logically relevant? That is, if I believe it, will it help me to decide the matter in controversy? If the question is answered in the affirmative, the next question that he asks himself: is there any rule of exclusion which prohibits me from looking into it? If there is no such rule, the fact which is logically relevant becomes legally relevant. And then there is yet another question that he asks: and again to himself, that though the fact is legally relevant, is there any rule of admissibility affecting the admissibility in evidence of this fact? Again, if there is no such rule, the fact becomes admissible and the judge can consider it. But the judge in India would say, when a fact is offered in evidence, Under what section of the Indian Evidence Act is this fact relevant? Under what section? Because other questions have already been answered by Stephen. Stephen already did the job for the Indian judges. I won't say half the job. Almost all the job has already been performed by Stephen. So a judge in India would say, when a fact is offered in evidence, under what section is of the Evidence Act is this fact relevant? If it comes under one or more of the sections, as I already said that there might be cases where a particular fact is relevant under multiple sections. Relating to relevancy, then it is legally relevant. And the only question is its admissibility. So usually the stages through which a fact passes are three. One, that it has to be logically relevant, logical relevancy. But that is a stage applicable only in English jurisdiction. Legal relevancy. And finally, admissibility. And the court, by a process of argument, connecting the various relevant facts which are believed by it, which it believes in, comes to a conclusion whether the facts in issue in the case are proved or disproved or remain not proved. To the facts in issue thus proved, the law is applied and the rights and liabilities of the parties decided. So this discussion that we just had, although shows that relevancy and admissibility are loosely used as synonymous. How synonymous? Because if it is relevant, it must be admissible. And we had also seen that it has to be legally relevant, because only those facts which are logically relevant have been declared to be legally relevant. So often it is believed that relevancy and admissibility are loosely akin to each other. They are synonymous with one another. But you'd experience, you will find that in legal language they denote entirely different conceptions. How? One, facts which are relevant may not be admissible. And two, facts which are admissible may not be relevant. Facts which are relevant may not be admissible can be exemplified by looking into the scheme of what we call privileged or prohibited communication. that is set out in sections like 122, 123, 126, 127 of Indian Evidence Act. For example, a communication made by a husband to his wife or vice versa cannot be proved. Communication that takes place between client and an attorney cannot be proved. It's not that this communication is not relevant. Relevant it is, but not admissible. Why not admissible? Because the issue of admissibility is often governed by public policy. Public policy. If I commit a crime, come back home, confess to my wife that I have committed a crime, my wife cannot testify against me. She would not be allowed. Extrajudicial confessions you would find, and I believe that you have already started discussing with Dr. A.P. Singh. Admissions and confessions are relevant if certain conditions are met. But a communication that takes place during subsistence of a valid marriage between a couple is a privileged communication on the ground of public policy, and same is the case with communication between client and an attorney. A defense lawyer may know that the client whom he is defending has in fact committed a crime. It's not that the clients who engage a defense lawyer tell them that they are innocent. They have to disclose all the details. They have to in fact confess to their lawyer, to their attorney, that yes, they have committed this crime. And now they want the lawyer, the attorney in question to defend them. That's confession otherwise. You can't hide this from your attorney and expect him to defend you. You can't. So facts which are relevant may not be admissible. And facts which are admissible may not be relevant. Meaning that why you won't find that any of the provisions relating to admissibility of facts from section 6 to section 55 would apply. But still you would find that they have been declared to be admissible. Admissible. Here, admissible simply means that the court would allow evidence as to that particular fact. Allow. Whether the court would act on that, whether the court would rely on that, is another matter. But admissible simply means that the court would allow. If it is not admissible, it means that the court would not allow, or evidence as to that fact is not allowed. As to the second, that facts which are admissible may not be relevant, let me exemplify with the help of a 1962 decision. Though it's little early, but still I believe that I must state the facts and also what the Supreme Court had to say in this decision. The decision is Ram Ratan versus State of Rajasthan, AIR 1962, Supreme Court 424. Ram Ratan versus the State of Rajasthan, AIR 1962, Supreme Court 424. This refers to Section 157 of Indian Evidence Act. 157. Had you had your Bare Act ready with you? And I believe that those of you who have their Bare Act ready with them or can open it in another browser in their system would understand this decision in a better manner, or rather this proposition that facts which are admissible may not be relevant. The accused was, in this case, Ram Ratan, the accused was convicted on charges of murder. What were the evidence against him? The evidence against him consisted of the evidence of a single witness and the statement by another witness that the former witness, that single witness, told the latter immediately after the incident that the appellant committed the murder. Look at this more carefully. The evidence against the appellant consisted of the evidence of a single witness and the statement by another witness. That single witness, the former one, had told him immediately after the incident that the appellant committed the murder. So the question that was considered by the Supreme Court in this case, that whether the statement of the latter witness was admissible under section 157 in the absence of a statement by the first witness in the court, that he told the names of the accused to the latter witness. The Supreme Court had this to say, and let me quote from the judgment. The Supreme Court said that there are only two things which are essential for this section 157 of the Indian Evidence Act to apply. The first is that a witness should have given testimony with respect to some fact, and the second is that he should have made a statement earlier with respect to the same fact at or about the time when the fact took place or before any authority legally competent to investigate the fact. Meaning thereby, this latter phrase, or before any authority legally competent to investigate the fact, would include the police, the IO, for example. If these two things are present, the Supreme Court said the former statement can be proved to corroborate the testimony of the witness in court. The former statement may be in writing or it may be made orally to some person at or about the time when the fact took place. The court went on to add that if it is made orally to some person at or about the time when the fact took place, that person would be competent to depose to the former statement and corroborate the testimony of the witness in court. What kind of testimony it is? Please visualize a situation. Visualize a situation. A is the star, sole, single prosecution witness to a crime of murder. And the court wants corroboration of his testimony. Corroboration, that it must be corroborated. All right, that he saw the crime. All right, that he has also passed that rigorous cross-examination and all. But still the court needs some corroboration. Section 157 talks about this corroboration by calling a witness who would otherwise be a hearsay witness. Hearsay witness who otherwise would not be allowed to testify independently. The Supreme Court said that if it is made orally to some person at or about the time when the fact took place, immediately after that, again imagine, visualize a situation. I saw a murder at a secluded place, no one else is there. Immediately after murder was committed, another person arrived there. He didn't see anything except a body lying in pool of blood. I narrate the entire details to him. He didn't see anything. I again repeat. He didn't see. He only saw a body there. Relate that to what the Supreme Court said. If it is made orally to some person at or about the time when the fact took place, the fact of murder took place, that person would be competent to depose to the former statement and corroborate the testimony of the witness in the court. If the prosecution fails to produce the eyewitness, or is unable to locate the eyewitness, eyewitness is absconding, eyewitness is not available, the police couldn't identify who in fact the sole eyewitness was, the other man to whom the eyewitness had narrated the facts even shortly after the fact occurred, the fact in issue occurred, would not be allowed. His being a merely hearsay evidence. But by virtue of section 157, you would find that his testimony would be admissible, though not relevant in the sense relevancy is understood. So the Supreme Court went on to say that there is nothing in section 157 which requires that before the corroborating witness deposes to the formal statement, The witness to be corroborated must also say in his testimony in court that he had made that former statement to the witness who is corroborating him. And you can also refer to another decision in this regard. That is of 1959. Bhogilal, Chunnilal, Pandya versus State of Bombay. Bhogilal, Chunnilal, Pandya versus State of Bombay. This is AIR 1959, Supreme Court 356. To the same effect. To the same effect. So these two cases, one that I discussed in detail, show that facts which may not be relevant under section 6 to 55 are or may also be admissible. For example, admissible under section 150, 157 of Indian Evidence Act. And now very quickly, before we look into the scheme of relevancy from section 6 to section 55, not all the sections in that order of course, but I'll adopt that pick and choose and would be choosing the most important ones. Few of them are already being discussed by Dr. A.P. Singh, I know. But before that, another very important concept, presumption, that you find in section 4. Section 4. Presumption. Now, there is no single acceptable definition of what is meant by presumption, or what would cover different situations is available. And then different judges and different authors have defined presumption in different ways. Often, presumption is defined as an inference drawn by the court on the basis of reasoning from one fact or set of facts as to the truth or falsehood of another fact. Let me repeat it. Often, presumption is defined as an inference drawn by the court on the basis of reasoning from one fact or set of facts as to the truth or untruth, falsehood of another fact. And then there are few definitions in juristic writings. For example, Stephen himself says, and I quote, a rule of law that courts and judges shall draw a particular inference from a particular fact or from particular evidence unless and until the truth of such inference is disproved. And then one of the celebrated commentators on Indian Evidence Act, Sarkar, he says that a presumption is an inference of fact drawn from other known or proved facts. So these presumptions are defined in section 4 in three ways, in three manners, by using three different phrases. may presume, shall presume, and conclusive proof. And the Indian Evidence Act, let me make it very clear, adopts a classification that is different from that of English law. And how is that different? Under English law, presumptions are divided into two main categories: presumptions of fact and presumptions of law. Presumptions of fact are the ordinary presumptions. These are ordinary presumptions, according to which we proceed in day-to-day life. And simply put, as we have seen, a presumption means a supposition based upon strong probability. For example, if we see a man with a blood-stained clothes coming out of a room where a man has been stabbed, we presume that he is the murderer. Presume. This is a presumption of fact. Because that's a presumption which is based on logic and reason. Logic and reason. And is not arbitrary. A presumption of law, on the contrary, is an artificial presumption. It's an artificial. It's not something that we logically presume or assume. But the law says that such a presumption could be drawn. For example, with respect to an ancient document, old document, the law says that in certain circumstances it can be presumed to be genuine. And then from this we can easily see that all presumptions of fact are always rebutable. And in the example that I just stated, the suspect can show that someone else was the murderer. He can show. And that his clothes became blood-stained in trying to render assistance to the deceased. He can very well. But presumptions of law may be rebutable or irrebutable. That would depend upon the rule of law, which allows the presumptions to be drawn. If the rule says it is rebutable, then evidence to disprove it can be given. If the rule says it is irrebutable, such evidence can't be given. And this is, as I already said, this is the classification adopted and recognized by the English law. But the Indian Evidence Act doesn't follow this classification. But it precisely says that certain facts may be presumed and certain facts shall be presumed. May be presumed and certain facts shall be presumed, and that certain facts operate as conclusive proof. So how is this may presume defined? Let's look into the language of section 4. Whenever it is provided by this act that the court may presume a fact, it may either regard such fact as proved unless and until it is disproved, or may allow or may call for proof of it. I repeat, whenever it is provided by this act that the court may presume a fact. It may either regard such fact as proved unless and until it is disproved, or may call for proof of it. Contrast that with the phrase shall presume. Whenever it is directed by this act that the court shall presume a fact, it shall regard such fact as proved unless and until it is disproved. And in the Indian Evidence Act itself, you would find another phrase, conclusive proof, which has been defined in this way, in this manner. And let me quote again from section 4 itself. When one fact is declared by the act to be conclusive proof of another, the court shall, on proof of the one fact, regard the other as proved, and shall not allow evidence to be given for the purpose of disproving it. Now remember, recall the English classification of presumptions into presumptions of fact and presumptions of law, where I just told you that presumptions of law may be rebutable or irrefutable. This conclusive proof, this concept, this conception is also a kind of presumption of law. And what kind of presumption? Which is irrefutable. When one fact is declared by this act to be conclusive proof of another, the court shall, on proof of the one fact, regard the other as proved and shall not allow evidence to be given for the purpose of disproving it. What would be an example of may presume? And unlike this, that whenever it is provided by this act that the court may presume, you would find that many other legislations, they also contain provisions as to may presume and shall presume. Reference may be made to section 114 of Indian Evidence Act. May presume. Reference may be made to section 114 capital A of Indian Evidence Act, again, shall presume. And reference may be made to section 112 of Indian Evidence Act as to conclusive proof. Let me end with this note. Conclusive proof, I'll be talking about may presume and shall presume in detail. But conclusive proof, when I'll be moving to that topic of conclusive proof of paternity or legitimacy, this conundrum. Section 112, if I'm recalling it correctly, says that if a child is born during subsistence of a lawful marriage, valid marriage, or after certain days of dissolution of that marriage on account of divorce, on account of death of the husband, the mere fact that the child was born during subsistence of marriage would be conclusive proof of the child's legitimacy. Legitimacy. So what has to be proved in order to prove that the child is a legitimate child of his parents? It has to be proved that the parents to whom he is born were lawfully married. He may have been born only a day after their marriage or a week after their marriage. But the public policy led to this presumption of law that we in the scheme of Indian Evidence Act call conclusive proof that the mere fact that he was born during the subsistence of a valid marriage between the couple, he would be the legitimate child. Now that's something entirely different from paternity. It's not conclusive proof of paternity. It's conclusive proof of legitimacy. But contrary to what this definition says, and shall not allow evidence to be given for the purpose of disproving it, when you would be reading section 112 of Indian Evidence Act, you would find that even this legitimacy may be disproved by showing non-access between the spouses. That during the relevant time when he could have been conceived, the circumstances were such that they had no access to each other. They had no access to cohabit with each other. So this is something that you